Welcome back. So far this semester we have been exploring normal personality and all of its many interesting variations, right? So you even did the Big Five personality assessment, and you assessed another person in your life. And no matter how high or how low your scores were, you know that still doesn't indicate a personality disorder. So that's where we're going to go today. What does it take to indicate a personality disorder? Okay. Now, thank goodness there are all these variations in personality, right? Thank goodness we have the right to be as different or as eccentric as we wish to be, as long as we're not hurting others. In fact, we have the right to be eccentric to the point of causing dysfunction in our own life if we don't mind it, if that is what we want. And again, thank God we have that freedom and that wonderful diversity in personalities. And I want you to keep this in mind because it's not unusual for a student to walk away from these lectures convinced that they have a personality disorder, when most of the time, by far, they do not. Okay? Or they might be convinced that they have two of the personality disorders. They might be convinced that they have all of them. So it's very important to study the criteria. Also, you may not be the kind of student that would walk away thinking that you have one or more of these disorders, but you may walk away convinced that your roommate or a sibling or a friend has one or two or all of the personality disorders. Not a good idea for a few different reasons. So first off, when we look at the criteria, you're going to see that they're probably much higher than what you suspected, the diagnosis criteria. Secondly, taking a personality class, or taking any undergraduate class for that matter, does not qualify you for diagnosing disorders. But then thirdly, probably the most importantly of all, is this is not a good way to make friends and influence people, right? All right. So what are the criteria? What does it take? So notice that there are 3 criteria here, and they must all be met. Also notice that there are 4 Ds, because one of the criteria is a D or a D, right? Okay, so let's start at the top here. The behavior must be deviant. In other words, it must be outside the norm. Behavior or thought processes. Deviant, in other words, outside of the norm. But that alone won't do it. You have a right, like I said, to be as deviant as you want, if you're not hurting anyone. So the second criteria is the behavior must cause dysfunction in your life. So cause dysfunction in your life, but again, that is not sufficient. If you aren't bothered by that, you have a right to be different to the point where it causes dysfunction in your life. You think about it. If you decided to live homelessly, your behavior would certainly be deviant, and it certainly would cause a lot of dysfunction in your life. It would interfere with your ability to be in a meaningful relationship. It could interfere with your health. It would interfere with your ability to get or hold a job. Be dysfunctional in many ways, but if you were not a danger to yourself or others, and this is how you wanted to live, you would have a right to do so. So that brings us to the third. All 3 must be met. The behavior must, or thought processes must be bothering the client to the point of demand. So in other words, they come in and ask for therapy, or the court must demand it. So there's a demand there by one or the other, the court or the client, or the person is a danger to themselves or others. Now, a danger to others is certainly not controversial at all. But the danger to the self, psychologists are rather split on that. whether people should have that ability to make that decision. Some psychologists feel that this is true and that people should have control of their own life. Other psychologists feel that when a client has signs of a mental disorder, they are not qualified to make that decision about their own life. And right now, that is what the courts agree with. And so if they are a danger to themselves or others, then they can be involuntarily institutionalized. Okay. Now, danger to others, by the way, is very rare with clinical disorders, even in the one category that is the farthest out of touch with reality, which would be extreme cases of schizophrenia. Even then, being a danger to others is very rare. In fact, no more so than members of the population who don't have a mental disorder. And we generally see that, except with one of the personality disorders. And we're going to look at that, and it's antisocial. People who have antisocial personality disorder are a menace to others. Most of them are not by far. Okay, but it is more likely than the general population, and we'll see why when we get there. It's kind of a definition of it, kind of a circular reasoning. But when it comes to being a danger to the self with certain mental health problems, certain categories of personality disorders, that is certainly going to be true, where that is more prevalent than the general population. Okay, so personality disorders are going to be defined this way: pervasive, long-standing ways of being that cause distress and impairment. That should sound familiar to you, right? Because that's basically the definition of personality, and then add on it that cause distress and impairment, right? You know, we're talking pervasive, we're talking durable, and those are true in both definitions here. Pervasive meaning this is not just affecting one area of your life. It's affecting all areas of your life. It pervades all areas. So school, work, relationships, etc. Okay. And long-standing mean durable. This is not a phase you're going through. This is something you carry through your lifetime. But there are tried and true ways of managing them in a way where their impact is diminished, where it is decreased, and your quality of life increased. Are kids diagnosed with personality disorders? No, they are not. So you must be 18 or over in order to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. And think about it. Personality disorders are defined as being durable, long-standing. So we need to have enough time to see that, right? Now, oftentimes you can see symptoms in kids' school records. So if they've been prominent, you can see a listing of symptoms. For instance, you might see something called conduct behavior. And then later on, when someone is 18, 19, 20, and they have shown behaviors as an adult that fall in the category of antisocial, that would be a way to look back and verify that in their childhood, because remember, this is long-standing, right? It should be there, but it should be in adulthood too. And then, those of you who have taken Psych 101, though it was a prerequisite to this course, so hopefully all of you have, you've learned about the axes of the DSM. There are 5 in all, right? And which one are personality disorders going to be listed in? And that is axis 2. Axis 2 of the DSM. Notice that the DSM has been revised many, many times. And right now we are at DSM 5, so the 5th edition of the DSM. Also, I want to quickly review what the other axes are for, because it's interesting. The first axes are the clinical disorders. So the clinical disorders are usually more extreme than the personality disorders. And if you had Psych 101, if you had abnormal psych, you know a lot more about those. But generally, they are more extreme. And then there's excess 2, of course, that's the personality disorders. And there's excess 3. So a client is evaluated on all of these before a diagnosis is made. And excess 3 is medical information. So why is it important to know a client's medical information before making a diagnosis? And the reason for that, you might have guessed, is that they might have a medical problem that is causing symptoms that look like a mental or disorder. Okay, so important to know their medical history. It's also important because they might be on a medication. Side effects of a medication sometimes can cause them to display symptoms that look like they might be a personality or a clinical disorder. So very important to know their medical history. Also, axis number 4 is their psychosocial issues that they're dealing with. So it's a psychosocial overview. And that's very important because, for instance, it's not unusual for someone to be depressed for a couple of years after a divorce. Okay? But if it goes on longer than that, there's something else going on here. And so very important to know, what psychosocial issues the client has been going through in the last couple of years. And then axis 5 is the therapist's assessment of the client's overall functioning, global functioning. So, how are they functioning? How well are they functioning in their personal life? So just, for instance, in their personal grooming, and how are they functioning in relationships? How are they functioning at work? How are they functioning in school? Okay, overall functioning. Okay, a final footnote on the DSM, in other words, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The 5 axes we just covered are from the DSM-4 and prior versions. The DSM-5 no longer uses axes. So why am I having you learn them? Well, for 2 reasons. 1, people are resistant to change, right? And that includes psychologists. So many psychologists still refer to the axes. But more importantly, number 2, disorders are still diagnosed in this way. In other words, it is still really important to know a client's medical issues and psychosocial issues and their overall level of functioning in making a diagnosis. In fact, the DSM-5 has even more of a focus on that overall level of functioning. And in fact, virtually the only thing that has changed regarding the content of the axes is that personality and clinical disorders are no longer separated as they were before. The reason they were separated before is because personality disorders were thought to be uncurable. Now, with new research and new treatments, the exciting news is that personality disorders can, at times, be cured.